Dust has a smell. Most people never learn that. 3 years of drought had taught Sadie Boone that it smells like iron and old bone, and something else she had no name for something that lived at the back of the throat and never entirely left. She knew it before she opened her eyes each morning. She knew it in the dark, lying still on top of the sheets, running inventory before she stood up and faced whatever the day intended to take from her. Left shoulder worse than yesterday. Right hip about the same. 3 toes on her right foot, the ones the tractor hitch had crushed into a single bent mass a decade ago, aching with the loyalty of old injuries in dry weather. That pain had become a kind of clock. She read it the way her father had read the sky, not with pleasure, but with the resignation of someone who had learned that the information was going to come whether you wanted it or not. The floor was cold under her bare feet. She stood anyway. The kitchen was dark. The coffee maker sputtered and spat, and eventually produced something dark enough to be useful. She leaned against the counter with both hands flat on the laminate and listened to the house breathe around her. Oak Haven farmhouses had their own language, and this one spoke in settling joists and loose window glass and the creak of the second stair she had been meaning to fix since her father died. She had not fixed it. She had told herself it was a matter of time and materials, and then the drought came, and there was no time and fewer materials, and eventually she had stopped telling herself anything about it. Some sounds you leave alone because the sound means something, because the silence that would follow the repair would mean something worse. Outside, the sky was the color of a bruise fading badly. The drought had taken the color out of mornings out here, leached it, the way it leached everything slowly and without ceremony, until what remained was a washed-out approximation of what things used to look like. Even the sunrises looked exhausted, like they were going through the motions out of obligation, rather than any genuine intention to be beautiful. She pulled her boots on in the doorway of the barn, the leather stiff and cold against her foot, molded over years to the particular angle that 3 crushed toes had imposed on her gait. She picked up the hay fork and started the day. The barn smelled of dry manure and ammonia, and beneath that faint and almost sweet, the smell of the animals themselves, the warm animal fact of them, which was one of the few things in 3 years of drought that had not become a source of dread. 20 head of Angus cross, and every one of them too thin. She could count ribs on the 3 oldest heifers without touching them, just by watching them turn in the early light, the way the shadow defined what the flesh no longer concealed. They swung their heavy heads toward her when she came in, dark eyes, patient and expecting the way animals look at people who feed them, and have not yet learned that the person feeding them might not be able to keep doing it. She moved down the line and pitched the morning ration. The sound of their tongues dragging against the metal troughs filled the low space of the barn. She did not let herself think about what she was giving them, or what she could not afford to give them. She just moved. Movement was the discipline. Movement was the thing that kept the arithmetic from becoming a verdict. She took her coffee out to the porch steps when she was done. The air had the pressed stillness that came before another day of killing. Heat that brief window before the sun got its grip on the valley and started squeezing. She sat on the top step, splintered along the edge, for as long as she could remember, and looked east. The back pasture ran flat and brown to the rusted wire fence at the boundary line, and beyond the fence, the county easement, and beyond that, the old quarry, though she could not see it from here. 54 acres of blasted limestone and abandoned equipment that had been sitting untouched since before she was born. It had always been background matter, a feature of the landscape she had catalogued, and ceased to register the way you ceased to register the sound of a clock that ran all the time. There was going to be an auction today, Before she could tell you why she bought that hole in the ground, she needed you to know one thing first. 3 weeks after that auction, a man in a pressed shirt and clean boots drove up her driveway and offered her $50,000 for it. She turned him down flat. She did not hesitate, and she did not negotiate, and she did not ask him to come inside. She just said no and waited for him to leave. She dumped the last of the coffee in the dead grass and drove toward town. The fairgrounds smelled of the previous weekend's rodeo sour beer, soaked into dry, ground cheap coffee it burned too long on a hot plate, and the sharper, less patient smell of men who had been up before dawn and were not going to let it show. The county foreclosure auction was held under a canvas tent, the color of old bone white, once yellowed over years of August suns, until the color had become something between resignation and surrender. Metal folding chairs sat in rows on packed dirt. Most of them were full. Sadie took a seat in the back row. She recognized most of the faces. Farmers from the north end of the valley, whose situations were different from hers only in degree. Ranchers from up near the ridgeline who had held on longer because the elevation gave them a few extra weeks of grass before the heat finished it. Equipment dealers who came because distressed property attracted distressed equipment, and there was money in both. Tax attorneys who understood the rhythm of collapse better than anyone because they had been timing it for years. She knew what each of them was thinking, because it was the same arithmetic she had been running herself, the long division of land that no longer produced enough to justify its debt. The remainder always the same number, always negative. Dennis Holden was standing near the center aisle with the composed presence of a man whose profession required him to be present at these events and whose instinct required him never to look like he had come for anything specific. He was the branch manager of First County Bank, thin and precise, built like a ledger with a face that gave away nothing. It was not paid to give away. His gray suit had not been cut for this heat. When he saw her, he moved through the row and settled into the empty chair beside her, without being invited. He did not offer a greeting. He looked straight at the empty podium and spoke at a volume calibrated for her ears only. He said the grace period was not indefinite. He said the bank needed something concrete from her, some indication of forward movement, something he could put in the file that read like a plan rather than a prayer. He said he understood it was a difficult season and that he was sorry for it. And he said it the way a man says he is sorry, when the apology is a formality preceding an action that has already been decided. She said she knew. He said it might be worth considering a partial liquidation. The herd. Even a few head would show movement in the account, would give him something to work with. When the regional office asked questions he could not currently answer, she did not respond to that. She watched Tom Briggs, adjusting the microphone, stand up front. A thick man with a face the color of old brick, flushed permanently from years of outdoor work in Oklahoma summers. A man who had presided over more of these auctions than anyone in the county, and who had found a way to live with that, which involved not thinking about it too directly. In her peripheral vision, Dennis had taken his phone from his jacket pocket. His thumbs moved across the screen. He was texting someone. She registered the fact the way she registered the smell of the tent, as information, as data to be filed and not yet interpreted. She let it sit. Tom Briggs spoke the way good auctioneers spoke, in that rapid musical drone that turned tragedy into rhythm, that made the loss of a generational farm sound like a square dance call that wrapped human catastrophe in the language of commerce, and kept it moving so the silence never had a chance to become what it actually was. Earl Donovan's 80 acres went up first. Earl was in the third row with the posture of a man who had decided in advance not to let this be visible. He was 62 years old and straight-backed and deliberate in his movements, a man whose body had been shaped by 40 years of the same work in the same fields, and he sat in that chair, the way a person sits when they have already grieved the thing that is about to be taken, and are now simply waiting for the formality to complete itself. She had known him her whole life. He had taught her to read weather from cloud formations when she was 12, standing in a field one August afternoon, pointing at a high, thin layer of cirrus, moving in from the west, explaining in his unhurried way, that what you saw in the sky told you what was coming if you knew how to read it. Mary's tail's looking west, he had told her. 3 days dry. She had never forgotten that lesson, or the patience with which it was given. The sky this morning had been a flat, merciless white in every direction, the kind of sky that told you nothing, because it had already decided and was not interested in your opinion. Tom opened at 40,000. Vance Mercer bought it with a movement barely visible from where Sadie sat, just the slight lift of 2 fingers, the bit of a man who does not need to compete, because the outcome has already been settled in a room she was not invited to. The gavel came down. Earl stood before it, struck the podium, and walked out of the tent without looking at anyone, without looking at Vance, without looking at the auctioneer, or the room, or the people in it who had watched the thing happen and found it easier not to say anything. He walked out with the deliberate, unhurried step of a man who had decided that the only dignity left to him was in how he left. Sadie watched him go. Her stomach turned over slow and cold, the way cold things turned. Vance Mercer settled back in his chair with the unhurried ease of a man who had accomplished the thing he came to accomplish and was now simply waiting for the next item. He was 52, dressed for a lunch meeting rather than a county auction. Everything about him oriented away from the difficulty of the room, as though he had learned to inhabit spaces like this without being touched by them. His hands were soft. He kept them in his lap like a man who had not needed them for anything rough in a long time. He had been buying up distressed properties in Oak Haven for 4 years, acquiring land at foreclosure prices, dividing it into parcels that he sold or leased to city people who wanted a weekend photograph of themselves in a field. He smelled of expensive soap and the confidence of a man who had not lost a bet he actually needed to win. He glanced at Sadie the way a man glances at furniture. Tom Briggs mopped his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief and leaned back into the microphone and said, "They had one more parcel. County tax seizure. Lot 42. The old quarry on the eastern boundary. 54 acres of well a hole in the ground." He said it the way a man makes a small joke to relieve the room of whatever was left in the air after Earl Donovan walked out, and the laughter that came back had the looseness of tension, releasing of people glad that something required nothing from them. Tom opened at 5,000. Nothing moved in the room. He lowered it to 4,000. Silence held. Someone in the 4th row coughed into his hand. Tom said, "Come on now, folks. 54 acres, you could throw rocks at things." The laughter was louder this time and longer, and the tent shifted as people leaned back into the comfortable certainty that this one was going to take care of itself, that nothing was required of them, that they could afford to find it funny. Vance Mercer leaned towards Sadie with his elbow on his knee, casual as a comment about the weather. He said she ought to buy it. Put her cattle down there and save on fencing. He paused a beat. Let that sit, and then added something else quiet, almost an afterthought, that he could take care of it for her if she wanted. It was those last 7 words. Not the condescension which she had long since learned to absorb the way skin absorbs sun through repetition and without drama. It was what those words assumed about her. It was the architecture of the assumption, the certainty that her land and her problem, and whatever remained of her options, were already within his reach whenever he chose to extend it, that she was a situation to be managed rather than a person to be addressed. She felt something ignite in her chest, sudden and clean and very old. The kind of anger that had been compressed long enough to become something beyond anger, something closer to fuel. She said $1,200. The sound in the tent changed. Not silence exactly, but the suspended quality of a room, recalibrating the collective hesitation of people trying to determine whether they had heard correctly and what it meant if they had. Tom Briggs straightened at the podium. Vance Mercer's chair came forward off its back legs. She was aware of Dennis Holden somewhere to her left, going very still, the stillness of a man who has just received information that complicates something. Tom said he heard $1,200 from the back. He said, "Miss Boone, is that a bid?" She said it was. Her voice came out level. Under the table, her right leg was shaking in small, rapid pulses. She could not stop the body doing what it did when the mind had committed to something before the body caught up. Tom asked for $1,500. The room held its breath. "Going once," he said. Her throat tightened around whatever she might have said. "Going twice." The gavel struck the plywood podium with a sound that climbed into her skull and stayed there. $1,200. Sold. She stood. Her knees had the uncertain quality of something not quite bolted in place. She walked down the center aisle to the county clerk's table, and she could feel Vance Mercer's eyes tracking her the way a man tracks something he is reassessing, and she could feel the room's attention following her. Not hostile, not unkind, mostly bewildered the way a crowd watches someone do something they cannot explain and are not sure whether to admire or pity. Loretta Bishop was behind the clerk's table with a receipt book and the composed expression of a woman who had spent 34 years watching other people's worst days from a fixed position behind that table, developing over time the particular self-containment of someone who has learned that composure is its own form of respect for what she was witnessing. She was 60 years old and had worked in the county offices since before Sadie was born, and had known Sadie's mother, and she looked at Sadie now the way a person looks at someone they have watched grow up and are not certain how to protect. Sadie took the checkbook from her back pocket. The cardboard cover was soft, from years against her hip, curved to the shape of her body. She wrote the amount, $1,200 even. The ink spread slightly into the cheap paper, bleeding at the edges of each number, the way ink did in paper that was not made to last. She tore the check along the perforation. The sound was very loud to her own ears. She held it out. Loretta looked at the check. She looked up at Sadie. She kept her voice below the hearing of anyone else and asked Honey, "Are you certain about this?" Sadie said to print the deed. Loretta held Sadie's hand for a moment. Not a transaction. The brief grip of someone with something to say and not enough time to say it correctly. Then she said, "Wait for me outside after." Sadie took the yellow carbon copy and walked out into the August sun. It hit her like something physical, a weight of heat that the tent had been filtering without her noticing, until she stepped beyond it. She climbed into the Ford. The vinyl seat burning through the back of her jeans pumped the gas twice by habit and turned the key. The engine ground through 2 attempts and caught on the third, smelling of unburned fuel and the particular exhaust of an engine held together by maintenance that never quite caught up to the deterioration. She sat with both hands on the cracked steering wheel and looked at the dusty windshield and did not move. She had just spent the last $1,200 in her account on a limestone crater. Nobody had wanted even when it was going for nothing. She had done it in 45 seconds of compressed anger while her legs shook under the table. She had a deed to a rock pile and nothing in the account, and 9 days before Dennis Holden filed the paperwork that would end it. She sat with all of that and tried to find a way to make it add up to something other than what it was. She could not. Loretta came around the side of the tent 15 minutes later with a folder under one arm and the walk of a woman who had already decided what she was going to say and was moving towards saying it. She got into the passenger seat without being asked and pulled the door shut behind her, with the firmness of someone who understood that what she had to say required a closed room, even if the room was a 20-year-old Ford pickup in a fairgrounds parking lot. She did not waste time. She said that Vance Mercer had met with Tom Briggs the previous evening. She had been in the back room of the county office when they spoke, and they had not known she was there, had not checked before speaking, the way people did not check when they were accustomed to that space, feeling like their own. She said it plainly, without any performance of outrage or drama. Vance had arranged informally for the quarry lot to pass through the auction without attracting serious attention. Tom would open the bid low and not push. It would move through it quickly and without enthusiasm, let it read in the room like a burden the county was eager to be rid of. Vance would acquire it quietly, below assessed value, and the transfer price would stay low enough to avoid the higher tax bracket that would have applied at fair market. Sadie looked through the dusty windshield at the empty lot across the road, where a dust devil was moving in a slow, purposeless spiral through the heat shimmer. She said so. I walked in and ruined a plan I didn't know existed. Loretta said yes. She said Vance was not laughing because he thought Sadie was foolish. She said he was laughing because laughing was the fastest way to cover the fact that he was not. Sadie held that for a moment. She thought about the way he had leaned toward her in that tent, casual, and certain the way a man leans toward something he has already decided belongs to him. She thought about the word arrangement, and what it cost a man like Vance Mercer to have one disrupted by someone he had already written off. Loretta said one more thing. She said that the name Boone appeared in the old county land records connected to that parcel. Records that predated anything. She had details on records old enough that the paper had become fragile in the way of things that were not made to survive as long as they had. She said she did not know the full story. She said she only knew the name was there, and she thought Sadie ought to know. Sadie said, "Thank you, Loretta." She drove home with the carbon copy on the passenger seat, and the sound of the gavel still sitting somewhere behind her eyes like a stone dropped into still water, still sending out its rings. She did not go to the quarry that afternoon. She went back to the farm and fed the cattle their evening ration, and checked the water levels in the troughs and fixed a section of fence near the road that had been pulling loose for 2 weeks. The wire gone slack where the corner post had started to lean, a small failure among the larger ones. She worked until the light was gone because working was the only thing that held the morning's decision at a distance, where it could not reach her directly. She went inside and ate cold beans from a pot on the stove without sitting down and went to bed. She lay on top of the sheets in the dark and ran the numbers until the numbers stopped meaning anything, until they were just symbols on the inside of her eyelids that corresponded to nothing she could change by looking at them longer. $1,200 had been her buffer, the last argument she had for Dennis Holden. Proof of a liquidity that might buy her one more month of grace. She had surrendered it in 45 seconds of anger, and now she had a deed to something useless and nothing left to offer the bank in 9 days before the deadline. She got up before sunrise. She did her chores in the gray, dark working, by the light of a flashlight hung from a nail in the barn rafter. She drank her coffee on the porch and looked at the dead grass and the rusted wire at the far edge of the back pasture and thought about what Loretta had said about the name appearing in old records, about the connection she could not yet see the shape of. Then she drove out to the quarry. She parked at the rim and walked to the edge and stood there for a moment before the scale of it registered fully. The quarry was larger than it appeared. From the road, a genuine shock of dimension. Once you stood at its lip, the walls dropping 60 feet or more into a bowl of pale limestone and dark granite, split by decades of industrial blasting and then abandoned without ceremony, as though the people who had worked it had simply stopped one day and walked away and not come back. The bottom was chaos, enormous slabs of stone scattered as though something had been violently disassembled by something enormous and left where it fell. The access road was steep and washed out, cut by years of rain, and then years without rain, edged with scrub brush and thorny volunteer growth that grabbed at her jeans as she picked her way down. The smell changed as she descended. The dry mineral heat of the upper pasture gave way to something cooler and older, the smell of stone that had not seen direct sun in years, faintly metallic and damp beneath the smell of the interior of the earth, which was a smell that had no equivalent anywhere above ground. Halfway down, she passed the excavator. It had been there since before she was born, a massive tracked machine half swallowed by a gravel slide from the western wall, its yellow paint scoured down to bare rust across most of its surface. The cab windows long since broken and replaced by vines and volunteer creepers that had moved in through the gaps and made themselves at home. She put her hand on the machine's steel bucket as she passed. Immovable. Sunk to the tracks. The metal hot from the morning sun and rough with the texture of oxidation of iron, returning slowly to something that predated its refinement. She kept moving. At the bottom, every footstep crackled loud on the loose, crushed stone, the sound amplified and returned by the curved walls. The quarry reduced the sky to a rough-edged oval of white overhead, framing it the way a window frames a view, making it smaller and further than it had any right to be. She walked to the lowest point where a seep had been working through a crack in the eastern wall for years, creating a pool the size of a large barn, opaque and a greenish color that spoke of algae and stagnation, its margins thick with growth. She picked up a piece of limestone from the ground beside her. Grapefruit-sized, cold to the touch, despite the heat, heavy in a way that felt like weight without purpose. She threw it in. The water received it with a thick, sluggish sound, and the ripples reached the shallow edges and died without drama. She said to no one, "You stupid woman." Her voice came back from the stone walls thin and diminished, stripped of whatever conviction it had carried on the way out. She sat on a flat boulder and tried to find the practical angle on what she had done. The rock could not be planted. It could not support grazing. It was not near enough to water to be of use as a holding area. She was not a geologist and had no way of knowing whether the stone had any commercial value, or whether it was simply mass weight without application, an industrial scar that had been sitting there since before her birth, waiting for someone foolish enough to pay for the privilege of owning it. She had done exactly that, with money she could not replace, motivated by a moment of anger at a man who would recover from the inconvenience in about 45 minutes. She stayed there until the heat began to pool in the enclosed air of the quarry building toward midday. When she finally stood, she did not head immediately back to the access road. She walked a slow circuit of the quarry floor, instead, moving without a destination, because staying still had become its own form of suffocation. She came around the far end of the rusted excavator, past the section where the gravel slide had buried its tracks almost completely. The eastern wall here was different from the surrounding faces. The limestone had been sheared cleanly away in one long vertical face, almost precise compared to the rougher blasting patterns elsewhere in the quarry. The cut looked almost surgical at this distance. She would not have known to notice it on her first visit. She noticed it now. Something was mounted to the rock at eye level. She nearly walked past it. A wedge of flat stone had fallen against the wall at some point and leaned there at an angle, almost completely blocking whatever was behind it. A corner of metal showed at the edge of the wedge, dark with oxidation. She stopped. She gripped the flat stone and shifted it. It was heavy 70 or 80 pounds of dense limestone, and it grated against the wall as she moved it. The sound of stone against stone, of something being uncovered that had been covered for a long time. Behind it was a cast iron plate bolted directly into the quarry wall with 4 heavy gang bolts, each one corroded nearly to nothing, but still holding, still doing the work they had been set to do in a time she could not precisely name. The lettering was raised cast into the iron at the time of its making. She leaned close in the quarry shadow and read it. Boone Stone Company. Below that, a founding date, most of it consumed by corrosion. 3 digits still legible in the raised iron. 191. The last number gone entirely eaten by the same process that had taken the rest of the years from that era of the quarry's history. She stood very still. She read it a second time. Her own name in cast iron, bolted into bedrock, she had purchased 2 days ago for $1,200 she did not have. She thought about what Loretta had told her in the truck. The name appearing in records that predated anything she had details on. She had not understood what that meant until now. Her grandfather's people had owned this. 3 generations back, this crater had been a working enterprise, had belonged to her family, had carried their name not just in a county record, but in iron bolted to the stone they worked. They had operated it, and then sold it in whatever crisis had preceded her own. And she had walked out of that auction tent, believing she had made the worst decision of her life, and had actually walked back onto ground that had her name cast into its walls. She did not cry. She did not say anything out loud into the quarry's listening silence. She reached out and put her palm flat against the iron plate, and it was cold, even in the trapped heat of the quarry. Coal, the way iron that has been in shadow for a long time, was cold, and she held her hand there for a long moment, without moving, and without thinking about what came next. Then she took her multi-tool from her belt. She worked the 4 bolts loose, one by one, each one requiring more force than she expected, corroded but not fused, holding, but willing to release when something insisted. She wrapped the plate in her jacket. She carried it out with her when she climbed back up the access road to the light. She did not build a story around it. She just carried it home. The phone rang at 4 in the afternoon. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had let go cold without drinking the cast iron plate, sitting on the wood surface in front of her, with the name facing up the letters, legible and still sharp, despite everything that had passed over them. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Dennis Holden said her name. His voice had the flat quality he used for necessary unpleasantness, the tone of a man who had decided that efficiency was its own form of mercy, that getting to the point was a kindness even when the point was a knife. He said the grace period had ended. He said the account was short in a way the bank could no longer accommodate without action. He said he understood the circumstances and he was sorry for it. He said she had until the 15th. She said she understood. He said again that he was sorry. She said she knew. She said goodbye and set the handset back in the cradle, with the careful motion of someone who does not want to betray what she is feeling through the force with which she puts a phone down. 9 days. She looked at the iron plate. Boone Stone Company, 191, and then nothing where the last digit had been. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up and went outside and sat on the broken step and listened to the silence that covered the valley, the heavy absolute silence of a place running out of water, which was a different silence from any other kind. She was still sitting there when headlights appeared at the end of the driveway, coming slowly through the ruts. The truck was old. It came in slow navigating without hurrying, the engine knocking in the way of a vehicle maintained by someone who understood it but could not afford what it actually needed. It stopped in the yard, and the engine went quiet, and a man got out. He was in his mid-20s, built with the particular solidness of someone for whom physical work had become structural over a number of years, wide through the shoulders, standing with a stillness that read as economy rather than tension. He was carrying a folded piece of paper. He walked to the base of the porch steps and stopped at a respectful distance and said his name, Bo Carver. He said he had heard she might need a hand. He knew livestock and he knew machinery. He was not expensive. She looked at him. She said she did not have money for hired help right now. He said board and meals was fine. He said he was currently living in the truck. She looked past him at the truck and then back at his hands at the way he was standing. A man asking for something without letting you see the need that was behind it, which was its own kind of skill and required its own kind of reading. She said, all right. She told him the barn was the building on the left, and there was a cot in the tack room, and she started at 4:30. He nodded once and turned toward the barn. At the entrance he paused, not as though he had heard something, but as though something at the periphery of his attention had snagged. He reached out and touched the cracked housing of the old hand pump mounted to the interior barn wall, running his fingers along the fracture line in the cast iron, feeling the extent of it. He held them there for a moment. Then he let go and walked on into the dark. She watched that from the porch step. She stayed there until the barn went quiet. She thought about Dennis Holden's voice. She thought about the iron plate on the kitchen table and what its existence meant about the quarry and about the land and about the particular nature of what she had done. She thought about Vance Mercer leaning toward her in the auction tent. His soft hands, his certainty, saying he could take care of it, as though everything that had once been hers was already in the process of becoming his by degrees, as though the transaction had already happened and they were simply waiting for the paperwork. The night settled around the farm. In the dead grass along the fence lines, something small moved and was still. To the east, past the pasture and the wire, the quarry sat in the dark. All that limestone, all that weight, silent and immovable, and now hers. She had the feeling sitting on that broken step, with the August darkness pressing in from every direction, that Dennis Holden had not sounded surprised when she had called to say she had bought the quarry. He had sounded like a man confirming something he had already expected to hear, filing information that confirmed a picture he had been building. And she did not yet know what that meant. But she was going to find out. Dennis Holden had known. She understood that later, when she had time to lay all the pieces, end to end, and see the shape they made together. He had known before she set foot in that tent. He had been watching her account drain across 3 years of bad seasons, and he had been in contact with Vance Mercer since at least the week before the auction. She did not have proof of that yet. She was going to get it. But on the morning 2 days after Bo Carver showed up in her driveway, she was standing on the back porch with a cup of coffee at 5:30, and what she knew was that she had 8 days left and a cast iron plate on her kitchen table, and a young man in her tack room who had not asked a single question she could not answer. Bo came out of the barn at 5:45 with a rag draped over one shoulder and a cup of coffee from the pot she had left on the burner. He was not the kind of man who required a greeting to start working. He sat on the step below her and looked out at the dead grass and the sky that was just beginning to show some color, and let the quiet sit between them, the way quiet sat between people who had been up for a while before the world came back to life. She had grown accustomed to his silences in 2 days. They were not the silence of someone with nothing to say. They were the silence of someone who had decided that most things did not require words, and that words added to things that did not need them were a form of noise, and he was not interested in that kind of noise. He said he needed to tell her something. She said, "Go ahead." He said he had seen the quarry the morning he drove in from the county road before he even knew it was hers. He said the eastern wall had a face of limestone he recognized. Gray, dense with the quality of stone, that had not been significantly affected by weathering despite years of exposure. He said he had seen stone like it once before on a highway project he had worked on before his current situation, a long subgrade section that had required massive volumes of crushed aggregate. He said the contractor on that project had paid $4 a ton at the quarry source. She set her cup down on the porch rail with deliberate care. She asked why he had said nothing the day he arrived. He said he had not wanted her to act on his word alone. He said she needed to see it for herself to come to it, the way a person came to something they were going to have to defend from their own observation rather than someone else's. He said that mattered when the time came. She looked at him. He was watching the eastern horizon, not her the way a person looked at something they had already finished thinking through and were not going back from. She said it could be low grade below the surface. It could fracture wrong for processing. He said it could be. He said he did not think it was. She picked up her cup. The coffee had gone cool in the morning air. She drank it anyway. She drove out to the county road an hour later. The survey crew was already working 3 white state trucks on the shoulder with their marker lights running 5 men in orange vests, moving across the scrubland with transits and surveying stakes and the unhurried purpose of people operating on a government schedule. She pulled up behind the last truck and walked toward the nearest man. His name was Ray Gallagher. He had the face of a man who spent most of his working life outdoors, sun-darkened and patient with the careful eyes of someone who read terrain for a living and had learned to reserve judgment until the measurements were complete. He said he was State Department of Transportation and they were doing topographic work for the Route 9 bypass corridor. She gave him her name and told him she owned the bordering parcel to the south. He stopped. Not a full stop, but a slight hesitation in his movement, the brief recalibration of someone making a connection. He went back to his truck and came back with a clipboard and a thick file of documents, folded and annotated. He paged to a section near the back and turned it toward her. The page was a geological survey document, old enough that the paper had yellowed at the margins and the printing had faded toward illegibility in places. Dense columns of stratum designations and technical notation in a format that had been standardized before she was born. He pointed to a line in the formation column. She leaned in and read it. Boone Formation. High-density limestone deposit Eastern Valley Corridor. Ray said it was a stratum designation that had been carried forward from an old survey through every subsequent document in the series. Someone had named it after a local family, which was common practice when a formation was first identified and cataloged by people working the area. He said the designation had persisted because the formation itself was consistent and well-defined, and once a name went into a document of that type, it tended to stay. He did not know the full history behind the naming. She looked at the notation. She thought about the iron plate in her kitchen with the raised letters and the founding date missing its last digit. She thought about Loretta telling her the name appeared in old county land records connected to the parcel. The pieces were assembling themselves without her having to force them. Ray moved on to the information she already needed to hear. The bypass route would run through the valley floor for 2 miles. Soil core samples taken along that corridor had come back inadequate for direct road construction. They needed to excavate down to hardpan and backfill the entire 2-mile length with crushed structural aggregate before any roadbed work could begin. The nearest commercial source with the volume and grade required was outside Red Creek. 45 minutes each direction. He said the diesel costs alone were going to create real problems for the contractor's budget before the first yard of concrete was poured. She said that sounded like a substantial quantity of material required. He said millions of tons was not an exaggeration for a project of this size on soil this poor. She handed back the document. She thanked him and walked to her truck and sat in the cab for a moment without starting the engine, looking at the dead scrubland through the windshield. 45 minutes each direction, millions of tons. And less than a mile to the south, a formation of dense limestone that carried her family's name in a geological document she had never known existed until this morning. She drove back to the farm. The county road map was spread across the kitchen table by the time Bo came in from finishing the morning chores. She had been writing numbers for 20 minutes, her handwriting getting tighter and smaller as the arithmetic concentrated toward a single point. She told him what Ray Gallagher had said. Bo sat down across from her. He looked at the map, then at the column of numbers on her pad. He took the pencil from the table and worked a column of arithmetic in the margin, with the fluency of someone who had done this kind of calculation before. In a professional context, someone for whom the math of material and transport had been a daily requirement rather than an emergency exercise. He said 200,000 tons was a conservative figure for what a 2-mile highway foundation in poor soil would require. He said at $15 a ton for material out of Red Creek, plus $10 a ton for hauling the contractor, was looking at $5 million in material and transport before the first load of concrete arrived. He set the pencil down and tapped the map at the point where the quarry sat, less than an inch from the penciled line representing the bypass corridor. She said the stone had to test first. She said that everything else was speculation until someone drilled cores and sent them to a lab. He said yes. He said she needed someone to come out with a rig and pull samples. He said the man who came to drill would not be coming out of charity or public service. He said whoever showed up with a drill rig already knew or strongly suspected what they were going to find. She should keep that in mind when the conversation turned to numbers, because that conversation was coming. She looked at him. He said nothing else. He picked up his cup and went back outside. She did not have long to sit with that before the problem came to her directly. The next morning, she was checking water levels at the far pasture trough, watching the float mechanism to see how fast the level dropped between fills, calculating how many more hauls the water trailer would need to make before the week was out, when she saw a county truck on the road. Not a survey truck. A white pickup with the County Environmental Services seal on the door, driven with the particular posture of someone executing official business and expecting it to be uncomplicated. Floyd Dixon was in his early 50s, solid through the chest, wearing the tan uniform of the County Environmental Office. He had a folded paper in one hand and a metal stake in the other, and he was walking toward the fence line at the quarry boundary with the direct purpose of a man who considered the matter already resolved. She came around the far side of the trough at a walk that became something faster. She put herself between him and the fence. She said whatever he intended to post on her fence required her to see it first. He identified himself and his office and said the county had received a formal complaint regarding the quarry parcel, citing an uncontained water feature as a potential environmental and public safety hazard. He said the complaint had triggered a standard review process, and he was authorized under county code to post notice pending the formal assessment. She said posting notice on private property without a court order was not something the county was authorized to do under the standard review process applicable to this type of complaint. She said she would be calling the county attorney's office from her kitchen in approximately 45 minutes. They stood facing each other across the dead grass, with the August sun bearing down on both of them. Bo had come up from the barn with a wrench in one hand and was standing 40 feet away, not moving and not speaking. Just present the way someone stood when they wanted you to know they were available. She heard a truck door close out on the county road. Earl Donovan came around the end of the fence from the roadside, wearing work clothes rather than the clothes he had worn to the auction. He walked at his own pace, deliberate and unhurried, and stopped on Floyd Dixon's side of the fence line and looked at him. He said, "Floyd." Floyd looked at him. Earl said that any easement document or notice pertaining to this parcel would need to accurately reference the surveyed property boundary. He said the eastern boundary stakes for this parcel had been driven when the adjacent land was still in his name, and he had been present for the survey. He said if Floyd intended to post a notice in connection with the water feature at the quarry floor, the exact posting location would need to be verified against the survey record to ensure it fell within the correct parcel and not on the county easement corridor, because an incorrectly placed notice would be procedurally void and subject to challenge. Floyd looked at the stake in his own hand. He looked at the fence line. He looked at Earl. Earl looked back at him the way a man looked at something he had decided not to move around. Floyd put the stake under his arm. He said the review process would continue through the written notice channel and that he would be in touch with the property owner directly through proper procedure. He walked back to his truck without further discussion. The sound of the county truck pulling out left behind a different quality of silence than the one that had preceded the confrontation. She looked at Earl. He said the property line information was accurate. He said he genuinely had been there for the survey and genuinely knew where the stakes had gone. She said she was glad he had been on the road this morning. He said he had taken to driving past most days. He said it was an old habit, something to do with the time that was available to him now. He turned and walked back to his truck at the same unhurried pace he had used approaching, got in and drove away without any further ceremony. She stood there for a moment, looking at the empty fence line where Floyd Dixon had been headed. Then she went inside to wait for the man in the clean truck. The silver Silverado came up the driveway that afternoon, coming in slowly, picking its way around the deep ruts with the caution of a vehicle whose owner did not want it damaged. Grant Roth stepped out. Pressed khakis collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to exactly mid-forearm. The boots of a man who went from truck to office and office to truck without his feet contacting the earth in any way that left a mark. He was the regional procurement director for Apex Heavy Industries, the prime contractor for Route 9. He said so with the brisk efficiency of a man who had learned that titles did necessary introductory work and saved time on both ends of a conversation. Bo had the old pump housing off its mount and was holding the cracked casting up in the direct afternoon light, examining the fracture line, turning it in his hands, the way a person turned something they were deciding whether could be repaired or needed to be replaced. He did not look up at the sound of the truck. Grant registered him with the flat assessment of someone deciding a person was not relevant to the conversation he intended to have. He looked at Sadie and said he was going to be direct with her. He said Apex needed a staging area near the construction zone. He said the quarry parcel had been identified as potentially suitable for temporary equipment storage. He said he could offer a flat lease fee, $10,000 for the project duration. And Apex would install perimeter chain link fencing at their cost, which would address the outstanding liability questions related to the open pit. She let him finish. She was leaning against the porch post with her arms crossed, looking at his boots, the clean soles. She said $10,000 was a generous rate for parking bulldozers. He said it was a fair market lease rate for temporary industrial use of a liability parcel. She said she was not interested in leasing it. She said if he wanted what was in the ground, he should say that, and they could have that conversation, and that pretending this was about parking equipment was not a conversation she had time for. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, a fraction of a second barely visible, like a hand turning over under a table. He said the stone had not been assessed in decades, and there was no credible basis for assuming viable commercial quality. He said his offer represented a meaningful sum given her current financial situation. She took one step off the porch, closing some of the distance between them. She said her financial situation was her concern. She said if he wanted the stone, he should bring a drill rig and pull cores, and they would both know exactly what they had. If the stone tested to DOT grade for structural aggregate, she would discuss a per-ton royalty arrangement. If it came back low grade, she would take his $10,000 for staging, and they would both stop wasting each other's time. He looked at her for a long moment, running the calculation behind his eyes, weighing risk against risk. He said he would have a rig on site in the morning. She said she would be here. He got in his truck. She turned back toward the barn before he reached the end of the driveway. She did not watch him leave. The drill rig arrived before 7 the next morning. A tracked percussion unit offloaded from a heavy flatbed by 2 operators who worked in the complete silence of professionals who had performed this setup enough times that verbal communication had become unnecessary. The foreman was a compact man named Cole who had the relationship with his machine that came from long partnership, who moved around it the way a person moved through familiar rooms in the dark. The drilling began before 8. The sound climbed out of the quarry like something being unmade, a high metallic shriek riding over a deep, rhythmic percussion, that the 2 sounds layered into something that vibrated through the rock and into the earth and up through the soles of her boots as she stood at the rim, watching. The quarry amplified it and returned it from the walls and made it seem like the sound was coming from everywhere at once. Bo stood beside her at the rim. He watched the operation for a while without speaking. Then he said once quietly that Cole had chosen percussion rather than rotary, and that percussion was correct for hard, dense formation, and that the penetration rate he was watching suggested the bit was not wearing fast. He said fast bit wear meant soft stone. Slow wear meant the stone was resisting. He said nothing else about the technical situation. They pulled 4 cores, long gray cylinders extracted from 4 different locations along the eastern face, laid carefully in wooden trays, consistent in color, all the way through each cylinder. No visible fracture planes running through them. No color banding that would indicate varying density or composition. Cole signed the chain of custody form with the efficiency of a man who signed a lot of them and handed it to the Apex representative who had arrived with the rig. 3 days for lab results, Cole said as he walked to his truck. She stood at the rim after everyone had driven off. The quarry was quiet again. Just the wind moving along the blasted stone walls and the distant sound of a crow riding the updraft above the east ridge, calling to something she could not see. Earl had come up to the road shoulder while the drilling was running. He had parked and sat in his truck for an hour, watching the operation through the windshield. She brought him coffee, and they stood at the fence line without talking over the drill noise because the drill made talking futile. When it was done, she asked him where he was sleeping. He said he had a spot. She said the spot had a name. He said the parking area behind the First Methodist Church on Route 6. He said the Reverend had not told him to move, and he had not asked whether that would remain the case indefinitely. She told him to come for dinner. He said he had no need for charity. She said she had too much pork chop and not enough conversation, and it had nothing to do with charity. It was a transaction, and he was providing something she needed. He looked at her for a moment, evaluating the offer for the framing she had put on it. Then he got back in his truck. When she came in from evening chores, he was sitting on her back steps with his hat in his hands, looking at the dead grass in the yard. The cow died at 2 a.m. She heard it before she was fully awake. Not a sound, but an absence. a gap in the ambient rhythm of the farm that she had been calibrated to for years without knowing she was calibrated. She had the flashlight in her hand before she had fully decided to reach for it. The heifer was down in the far corner of the east pen, 2 years old. The best animal left in the herd, the one she had been watching carefully as the foundation of next season's breeding program, the one she had told herself was going to be all right because she needed something in this operation to be all right. She went to her knees in the barn, dirt beside her. The eyes were open and glassed over and very still. The breathing was wrong, too shallow and too slow, the pattern of a system that had been failing quietly for longer than anyone had read the signs clearly enough to intervene. She had been hauling water on the trailer every 48 hours, since the creek went dry, and Joy driving to the municipal pump and standing there in the heat while the tank filled. Driving back, distributing. It was never fully enough. The heat pulled more out of the animals than she could replace with what she could carry, and this one had gone down the hardest, and she had told herself it was manageable. And it was something she could monitor and catch before it became a crisis, and she had been wrong about that. She worked water in through cupped hands for 3 hours. She pressed it against the muzzle and coaxed the tongue to move toward it, and stayed with her through the long middle of the night when the barn was very dark and very quiet, and the only sounds were her own breathing and the occasional shift of the other animals in their pens. At 5 a.m, the breathing stopped. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the gap in the barn roof, where a board had warped loose over the winter and never been replaced, a strip of sky, turning slowly from black to the color of old iron, the very beginning of a morning she had not slept through. The tack room door opened. Bo appeared at the pen gate. He looked at the pen. He looked at the heifer. He looked at Sadie kneeling in the dirt. He said she needed to dig at least 4 feet because of coyotes. That was all he said. Just the next practical fact, stated plainly without ceremony, by someone who understood that the next task was the only available path through what had just happened, that the next task was where you put the thing if you were going to carry it. They dug through the morning. Neither of them said much while they worked. The digging was hard in the way of hard things that did not care about the circumstances that required the same effort from you, whether you had slept or not, whether you had the energy or not. When it was done, they stood at the yard spigot in the morning light and washed their hands, and each went separately to the remaining tasks of the day without any further acknowledgement of what had happened. That evening, sitting on the porch after the light was gone, she told him what she had observed at the auction. The texting, the timing of Dennis Holden's approach, the quality of his sympathy, which was the sympathy of a man reading from a document rather than feeling something. Bo listened without interrupting. He said she needed Loretta Bishop in the room when she went to the bank with the lab results. He said not the next day, not when she had a chance to think about it. He said the minute the folder was in her hand, she needed to move on the bank same day. She said she understood. He picked up the wrench he had set beside his boot and turned it once in his hand. He said there was one more thing. He said Vance Mercer was leveraged significantly. He had seen it in the legal notice column of the county paper. Multiple parcels listed simultaneously as collateral against active loans. He said a man running that level of exposure operated on the assumption that every deal he was waiting on would close when expected. If one failed to close, the structure became fragile. If the structure became fragile enough, it came apart from multiple points at once. She said she had filed that away. He set the wrench down. He went inside. She stayed on the porch alone and looked east toward the quarry she could not see in the dark, and thought about fragile structures and the speed at which they collapsed when one critical piece refused to behave as expected. On the evening of day 13, the headlights came up the driveway again. The black SUV. She knew it before it stopped. She was on the back porch with a bottle of beer she had not been drinking the glass, warming against her palm in the still August heat. Vance Mercer stood in the yard below the porch steps with his hands in his pockets, dressed down from the auction, but carrying the same settled certainty, a man whose confidence did not depend on his clothes. He said he was going to make it simple for both of them. He said, $20,000 cashier's check in her hand, before 9 the following morning, pay the back mortgage, keep the farm step away from the situation clean. She said $20,000. He said it was double the county price, and she knew it. She looked at him. She thought about Floyd Dixon putting the stake under his arm and walking back to his truck. She thought about Dennis Holden's thumbs moving across his phone screen in the auction tent, while he told her he was sorry about the grace period. She thought about the word arrangement, which was how Loretta had described what she had overheard using that word carefully and precisely as someone used a word when they wanted you to understand exactly what kind of thing they were describing. She said, "You have already seen the core results." He did not reach for a denial. He let a moment go by, and in that moment, he made a visible decision about something. He said Dennis Holden was a pragmatic man who understood arithmetic. That was enough. She said, "Get off my land, Vance." He said she was drowning and he was standing there with the rope and she was choosing the water. She said she would drown before she took a thing from him. She said she knew what he had done with Tom Briggs, and she knew what he had arranged with Dennis Holden, and she knew about Floyd Dixon and his stake. And when she had the lab results in her hand, she was going to make sure every piece of it was accounted for in any conversation she had going forward with anyone who needed to know. He looked at her for a long time. When he spoke again, the certainty in his voice had not changed, but its register had dropped to something quieter, and in some ways worse. He said the money would run out. He said the quarry would be a hole when all of this was over. He said she had bought herself one season, and when the season ended, she would be standing next to a crater with nothing growing in it and nowhere left to go. He said it without anger, which was the worst way to hear it, because anger could be dismissed, but a calm assessment delivered by someone who believed it was harder to put away. He got in the SUV and drove out. She turned her back before his taillights reached the county road. She walked into the kitchen and sat down in the dark without turning on the light. The iron plate was on the table. She looked at the name in the darkness, just barely visible. She sat there for a long time. Then her phone lit up on the table. A text from Loretta. She read it once, set the phone face down, picked it up and read it again. The County Environmental Review Board had convened an emergency session that afternoon. Vance Mercer's complaint had been accepted for formal review. The ruling carried an operational restriction on the quarry parcel, effective at 8 the following morning, for 48 hours, pending initial assessment. She stared at the screen until it went dark. The lab results were not in yet. In 48 hours, she would be legally restricted from entering into any operational agreement on the quarry parcel. Grant Roth had brought his drill rig because he believed in what he was going to find. Vance had known what that was because Dennis had told him. And now Vance had used the gap between her and the results to try to close the door before she could get through it. She put the phone down on the table next to the iron plate. Outside, past the dead pasture and the rusted fence line, the quarry held. Everything it had ever held, all that stone, all that weight, unchanged and indifferent. She had until 8 in the morning. She was up at 4:30. Not because she had slept and woken, but because the night had run out and the dark had nothing more to offer. She dressed in the same jeans and flannel she had worn the day before. She stood at the counter and drank coffee without sitting down. Bo was already in the barn when she went out. He did not ask about the text message. She had told him the night before, standing in the dark kitchen, reading it to him in a flat voice. He had listened. He had said one thing. He said to call Grant Roth at 7 a.m. before the restriction took effect at 8. He said to tell him the results did not matter, that she was prepared to proceed on the basis of what both of them already understood about what was in that quarry. Lock and intent before the window closed. Not a contract. Just words on record between two people who understood what they meant. She called at 7:02. Grant answered on the second ring, which told her he had been awake and waiting. She said she was calling to confirm that regardless of the timeline on formal lab documentation, she was prepared to move forward with a royalty discussion as soon as the results were in hand, and she wanted that stated clearly and on record between them before the county's temporary measure took effect at 8. He said he heard her. She said she wanted to hear him say it back. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, Apex was prepared to continue the conversation pending lab confirmation, and that her call this morning constituted a good faith indication of intent from the landowner side. She said that was correct. She said she would be at his trailer at 10 o'clock the morning the results came in, and she expected the folder to be on the table when she arrived. She ended the call at 7:09, 51 minutes before the restriction became operational. Not a contract. Not binding in any legal sense. But words on record between two people who understood exactly what they meant, and Vance Mercer had not been on the line when they were spoken. She went out and helped Bo pitch the morning hay and did not think about it again. Grant called at 10 that same morning. His voice had changed in a way she heard immediately. The smooth professional register was still present, but under it was something contracted, a man working to contain information rather than transmit it casually. He said he would like her to come to the construction trailer. He said it would be better to look at the paperwork together. She said to tell her over the phone. He said it was better in person. She said she would be there in 20 minutes. She drove to the construction site without changing or washing her face. Bo watched her go from the fence line as she backed the truck out. She glanced at him once in the rear view and kept going. The Apex trailer sat on a pad of freshly scraped dirt off the state highway, a double-wide portable office with a generator running alongside it. Inside, the air conditioning was set far too cold the way of men who spent their days in intense heat and overcorrected when they had control of the temperature. It smelled of machine-printed documents and burned coffee and new plastic. Grant was behind a desk covered in rolled blueprints and manila folders. He did not stand when she came in. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk's surface toward her. She sat down. The chair squeaked under her. She picked up the paper. The laboratory report was dense with column data, compression ratios, chemical compositions, stratum classification codes in the notation system used by state transportation departments. She read past all of it to the highlighted line at the bottom of the primary assessment section. Material classification, Grade A, structural aggregate. Meets or exceeds all applicable DOT specifications for highway load-bearing. Base course application. She read it twice, set the paper down, looked at Grant. He said the stone was exceptionally dense. He said his engineers had run the quarry figures against the Red Creek source material, and the Boone Formation stone required significantly less processing per ton to reach finished specification. He said it was, in his exact words, cleaner than anything they had expected to find. He said Apex needed a minimum extraction of 200,000 tons over the next 4 months to meet the subgrade schedule. He said the company wanted to discuss acquisition of the full parcel. He named a number. $50,000 for the deed clean transfer Apex would carry all environmental permits and remediation going forward. She looked at her own hands resting on the table. She thought about what Bo had told her. 200,000 tons at $15 material, plus $10 hauling from Red Creek. $5 million in material and transport. He was offering her $50,000. She said no. He said it was a strong number for a 40-year-old abandoned pit with no active permits and an outstanding environmental review notice. She said the number she wanted was $2.50 per ton royalty basis. She retained ownership of the land at completion. She wanted a $10,000 advance against royalties, paid as a cashier's check before she signed anything. The vein along his left temple moved visibly. He said a standard royalty rate in the aggregate industry was 50 cents per ton on the high end. He said $2.50 was not a negotiating position, it was a provocation. She leaned forward until the edge of the desk was against her forearms. She said his logistics team had a choice between $2.50 per ton on material that was less than a mile from the job site, or running 50 dump trucks, 45 minutes each direction, burning $5 diesel, while his paving crews stood idle, waiting on base material, and the state transportation office called his project manager every other day to ask why the schedule had slipped 6 weeks and what Apex intended to do about it. She said he should call his logistics manager right now this minute and ask which of those two numbers was the provocation. He stared at her across the desk. She waited. He picked up the pen sitting on the desk surface. He clicked it twice. He set it back down without writing anything. He said $150 and he was done negotiating. She said $250 and a $10,000 advance. She said those were the numbers and she was not going to another set. She said she would be in this chair until he agreed, or until she stood up and drove back to her farm and started making calls because a job this size did not stay quiet. And there were other buyers along this corridor who understood exactly what grade A stone sitting less than a mile from a federal highway project was worth. The silence in that cold trailer lasted a long time. Outside, through the thin aluminum wall, the sound of a piece of heavy equipment reversing on the staging area, the repetitive mechanical beep of it patient and indifferent to whatever was being decided inside. Grant looked at the core sample cylinder sitting on the edge of his desk, the one he had kept as a reference. He looked at the route map pinned to the wall. He looked at his own hands. He said $250. He said the advance would be ready at 3 that afternoon. She stood up. The chair squeaked again. She walked to the door and opened it, and the August heat came in through the gap like something solid. She stepped out without saying thank you, because this was not a situation that called for it. She sat in the truck in the trailer parking lot, with both hands on the wheel, looking at the dusty windshield. She had been holding herself together for so long, and with such consistent pressure, that when the thing she had been holding together for finally happened, the release had nowhere organized to go. It came up through her chest and out of her as something ragged and involuntary, not a sound she recognized as her own voice, and she put her forehead against the steering wheel and let it run through her until it was done and there was nothing left of it. Then she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and started the engine. She drove to the bank. Bo had driven separately as they had agreed the night before. His truck was already in the lot when she pulled in, and he was leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, not looking at her, giving her the time she needed to get out of the truck and be herself again before they walked in together. She walked past him toward the entrance. He fell in beside her without a word. Dennis Holden's office was in the back of the building, behind a frosted glass partition, with his name and title in black block lettering. She pushed the door open without knocking. He was at his desk, with a half-eaten sandwich beside his keyboard. The lunch of a man who ate at his desk as a matter of professional efficiency, who had organized his work life around the elimination of unnecessary transitions. When he saw her, his expression passed through several adjustments very quickly, a series of recalibrations before settling on the professional register of careful concern. She set the cashier's check on the center of his desk. It landed on his blotter with a soft, flat sound. He looked at it without touching it. He read the amount. He read the name of the issuing company. He read the signature line. Then he looked up at her with the face of a man who has done the first number in a piece of arithmetic and knows already where it is going. She said it was a royalty advance from Apex Heavy Industries against a per-ton extraction contract she had signed that morning. She said the extraction total would reach 200,000 tons minimum over the next 4 months at $2.50 per ton. He did the arithmetic the way he always did. Everything visibly, his eyes tracking the columns in his head with the trained efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. When he arrived at the number, he stopped. His lips parted slightly. He said her name. Just her name, the way a man should said it when the word was buying him time to decide something. He reached for the check. He turned it over once and set it down. He said it was issued by an out-of-state corporate entity, and that standard banking procedure required a verification hold of 5 to 7 business days before the funds could be applied to any account balance. She looked at him. She let the silence sit for 3 full seconds, counting them. She said, "Dennis." She said it quietly, the way you said something you wanted to land without force, because force would let a person resist it. She said she knew he had been in contact with Vance Mercer since before the auction. She said she knew about the arrangement he had made, and she used the word arrangement the way Loretta had used it, as a word that meant something specific and documented. She said she had access to documentation of communication between his personal contact information and Vance Mercer's office in the weeks preceding the county auction. The door behind her opened. Loretta Bishop walked in with a folder under her arm. She was wearing her county office clothes, not bank clothes, which meant she had come directly from work on a working afternoon. She did not look at Sadie. She did not look at Dennis with any expression that could be called hostile. She set the folder on Dennis Holden's desk and opened it to the first page and stepped back. The top document was a printed email chain. It had been copied to the county recorder's office as part of a formal correspondence regarding a county-recorded easement instrument, which made it a matter of public record under county filing procedure, which meant Loretta had pulled it the same way she pulled anything else that had been filed in her office in 34 years of working there. Dennis looked down at it. Loretta said she had been in county records for 34 years. She said she had a professional obligation to ensure that any transaction touching county-recorded instruments was conducted without conflict of interest on the part of any party with fiduciary responsibilities to the persons involved. She said that obligation was not selective, and it did not have exceptions based on the positions of the parties. Dennis looked at the email chain. He looked at the cashier's check on his blotter. He looked at Sadie. She said, "Process the check today, Dennis." He picked up the check. He turned to his computer and opened the internal processing screen and entered the deposit with the deliberate keystrokes of a man who had made a decision about his own situation and was acting on it before the decision could change. He reached to the intercom on his desk and pressed the call button and told the teller at the front window to apply the incoming deposit to the Boone account and mark it same day cleared. No one said anything else. Sadie took the transaction receipt from the printer tray when it fed out. She folded it and put it in her shirt pocket. She walked out of the office with Bo behind her and Loretta behind him. In the parking lot, Loretta put her hand briefly on Sadie's arm, in the way of someone who had more to say, and had decided that the parking lot of the First County Bank on a Tuesday afternoon was not the place to say it. She got into her county truck and drove back to work. Bo drove back to the farm in his own truck. Sadie sat in the Ford for a moment with the receipt in her pocket and the afternoon sun bearing down on the windshield. She drove home and fed the cattle their evening ration and fixed a loose hinge on the barn door that had been sticking for a week and went to sleep at 8 o'clock and did not move until morning. The machines came at dawn 4 days later. Flatbeds carrying tracked excavators, rock crushers built like industrial digestive systems, the massive jaw assemblies packed in transport cradles, fuel tankers with apex markings, a convoy of dump trucks that turned the county road into a washboard of churned calichet within the first week of operation. They tore into the quarry with the impersonal efficiency of heavy equipment that did not register what it was chewing, that was indifferent to the history of what it was dismantling. The percussion drill holes from the sample run were followed by larger diameter charges placed by a blasting crew that moved through the quarry floor in near silence and evacuated 20 minutes before each detonation, with the practiced calm of people who had done this in many places and had learned to take no unnecessary interest in the work itself. The blasting siren became the rhythm of her days. 3 long mechanical wails before each shot. Then the pause, the brief, absolute stillness before the charge. Then the ground heaved, not like an earthquake, but like something breathing a single massive exhalation from deep in the earth. The sound arrived a half-second behind the motion, a concussive thump that climbed through the barn foundation and into her knees when she was standing on bare ground. The cattle pressed together in the far corner of the east pen, every time shoulder-to-shoulder eyes rolling back to white, and then settled again when the silence returned, the rolling unsettlement and recovery becoming in time a kind of daily punctuation. 3 weeks into the operation, a charge in the northeast face threw more force than the engineers had calculated for that particular section of wall, and the cow barn cracked along the old mortar line between the original structure and the addition her father had built on the eastern end. Not a structural collapse. 3 boards displaced along the upper wall, and a section bowed outward 6 inches from vertical. Enough to let the cold night air in, enough to let 2 heifers push through the gap into the dark pasture. She and Bo spent the night recovering them. He was on the barn roof by 3 in the morning, with a flashlight between his teeth and a box of roofing nails running replacement boards across the gap by feel and by the small circle of flashlight working quickly and without complaint. She handled material up from below, passing boards and nails up over the edge of the roof to his reaching hand. At one point, he called down without looking, just his voice from above in the dark that she needed to get galvanized nails when she went to town. He said the box in the tack room was plain steel and would rust through in 2 seasons, and then she would be doing this again. She said she would get them Friday. He said good and went back to nailing. The next morning, she drove to the Apex trailer and walked in without knocking for the second time. Grant looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had not particularly wanted it. She told him about the barn wall. She set her hand flat on the surface of his desk and told him she wanted a damage liability addendum to the contract drafted and signed before the next detonation sequence began. She said she would wait for it. He looked at her hand on his desk. He picked up his radio and called the site foreman and told him to hold the afternoon blast sequence pending a structural review. Then he called his legal office. The addendum was drafted and signed before noon. After that, nobody at the Apex site treated Sadie Boone as a variable to be managed. The first royalty check arrived in a thick envelope 6 weeks into the extraction. She opened it at the kitchen table with the same coffee cup she used every morning, sitting in the same chair with the cast iron plate still on the table where it had sat since she carried it up from the quarry floor. She looked at the check for a long time without moving. $48,750. The figure sat on this table next to a stack of electric bills and looked like a number that had been put in the wrong place. She drove to the feed store. She ordered 3 tons of premium alfalfa and a full pallet of mineral lick blocks and handed the cashier's check over for the full amount without discussing it. The old man behind the counter wrote the order down without comment, the slow, deliberate handwriting of someone who had been filling out the same form in the same store for a long time. When she turned to leave, he spoke to the order pad rather than to her. He said her father had bought the cheap mix for 40 years. He paused. He said he was glad for her. That was all. She stopped at the door. She nodded once, her back to him, and walked out into the heat. The phone rang 2 days later. Dennis Holden. His voice had a new quality, now pliant, where it had been compressed. Accommodating, where it had been efficient, the voice of a man who had reassessed what kind of relationship he was dealing with and was adjusting accordingly. He said the account was in excellent standing. He said if she was interested in a line of credit for equipment acquisition or herd expansion, the bank would be pleased to put something together at a favorable rate. She said she did not need a line of credit. He said of course. He said to have a good day. She said she intended to. She hung up. The town adjusted to the new information about Sadie Boone, the way small towns adjusted to anything that disrupted their established understanding of who was going to fail and who was going to be all right. It was not a graceful adjustment. Janet Weaver stopped her in the feed store parking lot with the wide, warm smile of someone who had entirely forgotten what she had said 3 months ago about liability, and the crazy woman who bought a rock pit and told her the whole county was proud of what she had done, and that her late husband had always said the Boones were survivors. Sadie said thank you for that and got in her truck. Vance Mercer drove past the quarry fence line twice in October, slowing both times to watch the operation from the county road. He did not stop and did not attempt to speak to her. She watched him from the back pasture on the second occasion, leaning against a fence post with a coffee cup, making no effort to conceal that she had seen him. He saw her watching from across the pasture. He rolled his window down. He looked at her across the distance for a few seconds. Then he rolled it back up and drove on without stopping. In the second week of November, Loretta called. Her voice was composed and deliberate, the voice she used when she was choosing her words for precision rather than speed. She said the bank had moved on 3 of Vance Mercer's properties simultaneously. She said the notices had been filed in the county record that morning. She said the 80 acres that had been Earl Donovan's land was included and would go to auction that Friday with an opening bid set to recover the outstanding debt. Sadie had been expecting this. Not the exact timing, but the shape of it. Bo had told her 3 months ago, sitting on the porch with a county newspaper in his hand, that Vance was over-leveraged, that a man running that level of collateral exposure operated on the assumption that every deal closed when expected. One had not closed the way Vance had built his structure to expect. The structure had gone fragile, and then it came apart. The way fragile structures came apart all at once from multiple points, the whole thing collapsing, because the load it was carrying had been calculated for conditions that no longer existed. She drove to the First Methodist parking lot that evening. Earl's truck was in its spot near the side entrance of the building, the interior light on a paperback open on the steering wheel. She knocked on the glass. He rolled the window down. She said there was an auction Friday. He said he had heard. She said she wanted him to come with her. He looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, the way a man looked at someone he had watched make decisions for a long time and had formed an opinion about. He said he did not take charity. She said she needed someone who knew the boundary history of the parcel in case there were questions. She said it was a professional request. He held her gaze for a moment, weighing it. Then he folded the corner of his page carefully and closed the book. Friday morning, the tent was less full than it had been in August. The late season had thinned the crowd. Tom Briggs ran the session with the brisk pace of a man who wanted to be somewhere warmer before noon. When the 80-acre parcel came up, Sadie raised her card. Nobody raised it against her. Vance Mercer was not in the tent. The gavel came down clean. She signed the documents at Loretta's table. Loretta processed them without speaking. When the folder was complete, Loretta slid it across the table toward her and held it there under her hand for just a moment before letting go. Outside in the parking area, Sadie walked to where Earl was standing beside his truck. He was wearing his hat, standing with his hands at his sides, patient in the way of a man who had been patient in a lot of places recently and had found a way to carry it without letting it become something other than what it was. She held the folder out to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. She said it was his land. She said she had bought it so it did not go somewhere else. He said he could not repay it. She said that was not what repayment meant, and he knew that. He took the folder. He held it in both hands and looked at the top page for a long time. She did not try to fill the silence. When he finally looked up, there was something in his face she did not have a precise word for. Not gratitude, which was too simple. Something older and more specific than gratitude. The expression of a man receiving back something he had stopped believing could be returned and who was adjusting to that fact in real time. He nodded once. She nodded back. She drove home. The last blast came on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November. She was in the barn when the siren ran its 3 long wails. She had heard it enough times by now that her body had stopped treating it as emergency information had cataloged it as ordinary as the expected signal of a scheduled event. The cattle still flinched and pressed together when the ground moved. She stood steady through the pause and through the detonation and watched the dust column rise above the quarry rim through the open barn door. Then the crushers stopped. It was not a gradual winding down. It was a cessation, the machinery going quiet in stages over about 10 minutes until the valley held a silence that was layered and ringing and absolute in the way that silence was only absolute when it followed a sustained, loud sound, when the ears were still shaped around something that was no longer there. The backup beeps of the dump trucks quit. The excavator engines dropped to idle and then cut. The compressor units shut down one by one. In the space of 10 minutes, the valley went quiet for the first time since August. She stood in the barn doorway and listened to it. Bo came up beside her and stood there without speaking. She said yes. He said yes. Grant Roth came with a manila folder 2 days later. The environmental sign-offs, the lease, released the final survey of extraction quantities. The total tonnage had exceeded 240,000. He handed her the folder in the yard without ceremony, said the parcel was released back to her possession as of that morning, said Miss Boone in the flat voice of a man completing a transaction he was glad to be finished with. He got back in his truck and drove out, bottoming the suspension on the main rut near the road without slowing for it. She stood in the yard and looked at the folder. Then she walked east. She went through the back pasture gate and across the brown, dead grass and kept walking until she reached the rim. The quarry she had purchased in August was gone. What remained was something else entirely, a terraced canyon running more than 100 feet deep. Now the walls cut clean and geometric, by 4 months of precision, blasting the angles sharp and deliberate, the geometry of something constructed rather than destroyed. It was vast, and it was silent, and it was entirely hers. She stood at the rim and looked down. The stagnant green pool she had thrown a rock into in August was gone, excavated out in the second month of operation when the crews worked down to that level. In its place at the lowest terrace, water was moving. Not much. Not yet. A thin, persistent seep emerging through the fractured limestone face, running in a bright, clear thread along the terrace floor, collecting in the bowl at the lowest point, with the unhurried patience of water that had nowhere urgent to be. She could see the stone through it from this height. It was cold-looking, clear the way deep water was clear, the kind of clarity that came from pressure and darkness and distance from the surface. She had seen the difference in this water from the first day she came down here, had noticed that the flow at the base of the eastern wall was not the same stagnant surface water, as the green pool was fed from something deeper by a mechanism she had not had language for. The drilling and the blasting had opened the formation along its natural fracture planes. The aquifer beneath the limestone was finding its way through the cracks and emerging into the canyon that the drilling had created, offering itself to whatever came next. She thought about what it might mean, not just for her pastures which had run dry in July and not recovered, but for the farms east of here, the ones whose creek tributaries fed from the same subsurface formation. She did not have answers. She was a rancher, not a hydrologist. But the water was there, and it was clean, and it was coming from a place that did not depend on rain. A cold drop struck the back of her neck. She looked up. The sky to the northwest had changed while she was looking down. The clouds had lost their definition and were thickening and descending the ceiling, coming down toward the ridgeline. Another drop hit her cheek, then her shoulder, then the brim of her hat. Then it came, not a slow build, not a warning. The sky simply broke open all at once, rain coming down with sudden, full weight, hammering the exposed limestone of the quarry walls and the dead grass of the pasture behind her, with a sound that filled the valley from wall to wall, the sound of something long overdue, arriving all at once. The smell that came up from the dry ground was immediate and complex, crushed mineral dust and iron, and beneath those something older, the smell of soil that had been waiting, the smell of ground that remembered water. She did not move. The rain soaked through her flannel in the first 30 seconds and ran cold down her back and plastered her hair flat against her face. And she stood at the rim of the canyon she had bought, with her last $1,200 out of spite and anger, and something she had not understood at the time was actually recognition, something older than either of those things, and she let it come down on her. The cattle were in the far pasture. She could hear them through the rain, a sound she associated with relief rather than distress, their big heads lifting into the downpour. Standing in the open rain they had not felt in 8 months, letting it wash the limestone dust from their coats in pale gray rivulets. She thought about Earl holding that folder in both hands in the parking lot, looking at it for a long time before he looked up. She thought about Loretta walking into Dennis Holden's office in her county clothes on a Tuesday afternoon with a folder under her arm, setting it on the desk and stepping back without drama. She thought about Bo on the barn roof at 3 a.m, talking about galvanized nails versus plain steel, and why the difference mattered. She thought about the iron plate on her kitchen table, the raised letters she had read by quarry shadow on a morning when she had nothing and could not yet see what she was standing on top of. She thought about Dennis Holden's voice on the phone, the efficient sympathy of a man who had already decided the outcome. He had known. He had been working against her since before she set foot in that auction tent, and she had walked into his plan by accident, had bought the wrong thing for reasons that had nothing to do with the stone, and had walked back onto ground that her family had worked before her, and that carried their name in iron bolted to the bedrock. She turned her back on the canyon. She walked toward the house, through the rain, through the mud that was already forming from the saturated surface of ground that had been dry for too long and was now trying to absorb more than it could hold all at once. Each step pulled at her boots that deep, sucking resistance of earth, coming back to itself the sound and sensation of ground that was no longer empty. She walked through it without fighting it, through the dead grass that would not be dead much longer, past the fence line, through the gate across the yard. The farm lights were on across the pasture. The barn was dark, but solid. The new boards Bo had run across the broken section, pale against the weathered gray of the rest of the wall. The old farmhouse stood in the rain, the same way it stood in everything. Peeling paint and settling joists and the second stair that would still creak in the morning, the same as it had always creaked. Bo was on the porch when she came through the gate. He had her dry jacket folded over the porch railing, set there without comment, available if she decided she wanted it. She went up the steps and past it, and pushed the door open and went inside. He folded the jacket over the back of a chair and followed her in. She stood in the kitchen and let the water run off her onto the floor. She looked at the cast iron plate on the table, the letters still clear, still carrying the weight of whoever had stood where she was standing and worked the stone, and given their name to a formation that had outlasted everything they built and lost and sold, and could not hold on to. She said, "It is done." She did not say what she meant by it. Bo did not ask. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the counter and set one on the table in front of the empty chair across from him and sat down. She sat down. Outside, the rain kept coming down on Oak Haven, on the dead grass, in the brown fields, in the quarry canyon, in the aquifer, finding its way up through the fractured stone on the farms east of the valley, where the creeks had run dry, in July, on Earl Donovan's 80 acres, where the corn had grown for 40 years, before everything fell apart on all of it, steady and indifferent and long overdue. If this story reached something in you, something about land and holding on, and the kind of decisions that look like mistakes until they do not hit that like button and leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done with $1,200 and a hole in the ground. Subscribe and ring the bell, because the next story is already coming and you will not want to miss it.